The first time Thessa Rook saw her name growing in the soil, she froze mid-step on the worn path that cut between the valley farms and pretended with everything in her that she had not seen it at all. It was impossible to miss. The field belonged to Caleb Orson, the human farmer whose land bordered the eastern edge of where the orc families had been permitted to settle 3 years prior. His property stretched across the gentle slope that caught the morning sun, and for the past month, she had watched him work that field from before dawn until well after dusk, bent over furrows with the kind of grim determination she recognized in herself. She had assumed he was simply late getting his spring crop in. She had assumed he was planting in the usual straight rows that made harvest efficient and predictable. She had assumed, in the quiet way she assumed most things about the humans in this valley, that she was beneath his notice entirely. The 6 letters of her name stretched across nearly an acre, spelled out in the bright new green of sprouting wheat. Thessa. Each letter 10 feet tall, the lines thick enough to read from the road, the curves of the S-shapes painstakingly smooth. The rest of his field lay empty, the dark soil bare and waiting, but he had given over his best land, the portion that drained well and caught the most light, to spelling her name in grain that would take 4 months to harvest. Thessa's heart hammered against her ribs. Her mouth went dry. She looked at it once, let the reality of it crash over her like cold water, and then she made herself keep walking as though she had seen nothing more interesting than another tilled field. She did not let her stride falter. She did not turn her head for a second look. She walked all the way to the village commons where the orc families gathered each morning to collect work assignments, and she did not say a word to anyone about what Caleb Orson had carved into the earth. She told herself she had not been certain. The angle had been wrong. Perhaps it was a pattern for irrigation, something humans did that orcs did not understand. Perhaps she had imagined the letters because she was tired, because she had been walking that path every day for 3 years, and her mind had begun to invent things to break the monotony. Perhaps it was not her name at all, but someone else's, some human girl from the village with a similar name, and it would be mortifying to assume otherwise. But she knew. She had read the Valley speech since she was a child, had learned letters from her mother who had learned them from a traveling merchant who believed orcs had souls. She knew her own name. And she knew, with a certainty that made her stomach twist, that Caleb Orson had planted an entire field to spell it out. She collected her assignment for the day. Fence repair on the Miller property, 2 miles north. She took her tools and walked back past Caleb's field, because that was the only path north, and this time she made a great show of looking everywhere but at the field itself. She studied the sky. She counted the fence posts along the road. She hummed a tune her sister used to sing. And when she came level with the field, she felt the weight of his gaze from somewhere among the trees at the field's edge, watching to see if she would stop, if she would turn, if she would acknowledge what he had done. She did not. She kept walking, her boots crunching on the gravel, her tool bag heavy on her shoulder, and she did not let herself look. Thessa Rook was 20 years old, green-skinned and small for an orc woman, built more like a willow branch than an oak. She stood barely 5 feet 4, and though her arms were strong from years of labor, she had always been slender in a way that made the human villagers do a double take when they first saw her, as though they expected all orcs to be massive and broad. Her tusks were small, just slight protrusions over her lower lip, and her black hair hung in a single thick braid down her back. She was not beautiful by human standards, she knew, but she was not frightening either, and in this valley that was perhaps the best she could hope for. Caleb Orson was a man of 30, a veteran of some border war no one in the valley spoke about, who had taken his discharge pay and bought 100 acres of marginal land that no one else wanted. He was tall, just over 6 feet, and built like a man who had spent his life doing hard things without complaint. His face was weathered, his hands scarred, and in the 3 years Thessa had lived in the valley, she could count on one hand the number of times she had heard him speak. He was not cruel. He did not spit when orcs passed his property, the way some of the village men did. But he did not smile either, did not nod in greeting, did not give any sign that he saw her as more than another fixture of the landscape. Until now. Until he had taken his best field and written her name in it. Thessa worked on the Miller fence until her hands blistered, driving posts into the rocky soil and stringing wire until the sun reached its peak and began to slide west. She worked through the lunch hour, ignoring the bread and cheese she had packed. She worked until the foreman told her she was done, and then she walked back down the valley road as the afternoon heat settled over the fields like a weight. She walked slowly. She told herself she was tired. She told herself she needed to inspect a stone in her boot. She told herself a dozen reasonable lies, and when she came level with Caleb's field again, she stopped at the fence and looked everywhere except at the enormous green letters that covered the slope. The wheat had grown even since morning. It was taller, brighter, unmistakable. Thessa. Her name, bold and patient, waiting. She saw him then at the far end of the field. Caleb stood beside a water trough, his shirt off in the heat, his shoulders bronze from the sun. He was not watching her. He was staring at the ground near his feet, but his posture was tense, coiled. And she knew he was aware of her presence the way a wolf knows when something moves at the edge of its territory. Thessa swallowed hard. She made herself look at the wheat again. It really was her name. There was no mistaking it. The letters were perfect, the spacing even, the whole composition clearly deliberate. He had planned this. He had paced it out, measured it, planted each seed by hand in lines that curved and straightened according to a design he must have sketched and re-sketched until it was right. It would have taken him weeks. Weeks of labor that should have gone into planting his cash crop, into ensuring he had enough grain to sell and enough to see him through the winter. Instead, he had spent those weeks on a declaration he could not say aloud, and now he stood at the far end of the field waiting to see if she would answer. Thessa turned and kept walking. Her face burned. Her hands shook. She clenched them into fists and forced herself to breathe slowly, evenly, as though nothing important had happened. As though she had not just walked past her own name written in wheat, planted by a man who had never spoken a kind word to her, but who had apparently decided she was worth an entire season's sacrifice. She did not understand it. She did not know what to do with it. And so she pretended, with every ounce of will she possessed, that she had not seen it at all. That evening, back in the small house she shared with her younger brother Grell, Thessa sat at the kitchen table and stared at her untouched dinner. Grell, 17 and still lanky in the way of boys who grew too fast, watched her with concern. "You sick?" he asked finally. "No. You have not eaten anything. I am not hungry." Grell frowned. He was a good brother, patient and steady, but he was not perceptive. If she did not tell him what was wrong, he would not guess, and she was grateful for that. "There was a fight at the Commons today," Grell offered, clearly trying to fill the silence. "One of the Marsh boys got into it with a human over a job. Foreman broke it up before it got bad." "That was foolish," Thessa said quietly. "Yeah, Mama would have boxed his ears. Their mother had died 2 winters ago, a fever that swept through the orc settlement and took a dozen of the elderly and weak. Their father had died years before that, in the war that had driven their clan south into human territory. Thessa and Grell were each other's only family now, and the responsibility of that sat heavy on her shoulders most days. "I am going to bed," she said, pushing back from the table. "It is barely dark. I am tired." She was not tired. She was wound tight as a spring, her mind racing, her heart doing strange things in her chest every time she thought of the field. She lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling beams and tried to make sense of what Caleb Orson wanted from her. Men did not plant fields spelling out the names of women they felt nothing for. That much was clear. But what did he feel? Desire, affection, love. And why, after 3 years of silence, had he chosen now to declare it? What had changed? What had she done to draw his notice? She thought back over the past months, searching for some moment of connection, some conversation or glance that might have sparked this. She came up empty. She had seen him, of course. Everyone saw everyone in a valley this small. She had walked past his land 100 times. She had bought eggs from him once at the village market, a brief transaction in which he had taken her coins and handed over a basket without meeting her eyes. She had helped pull his cart out of the mud last spring when a wheel broke on the road, but so had 4 other people, and he had thanked them all with the same curt nod. There was nothing, no foundation for this, and yet he had planted her name in a field. Thessa rolled onto her side and pressed her face into the pillow. She felt strange, unmoored, as though someone had pulled the ground out from under her, and she was still falling. No one had ever wanted her before. Orc boys in the settlement looked past her to the larger, stronger girls who could work a full day in the fields and still have energy to dance at the evening fires. Human men looked at her with suspicion or disgust when they bothered to look at all. She had made her peace with that. She had decided, in the quiet way one decides things that hurt too much to examine closely, that she would live her life alone, that she would care for Grell until he was grown, and then find some small piece of contentment in work and routine, and the passing seasons. And now Caleb Orson had planted a field with her name in it, and she did not know how to be wanted. She did not sleep that night. When dawn came, she rose and dressed and walked back down the valley road, and when she reached Caleb's field, she made herself look at the sky, at the trees, at the fence posts, at everything except the bright green letters that seemed to grow larger and more insistent with every passing hour. He was waiting by the road this time, leaning against a fence post, arms crossed, his face unreadable. He did not call out to her. He did not move. He simply stood there, watching, and when she walked past without acknowledging him, she felt his gaze follow her like a physical touch. Her hands were shaking again. She shoved them into her pockets and kept her stride even, measured, and refused to let herself break. At the Commons, she was assigned to help with a roof repair in the village proper. It was a human house, the family watching her with wary eyes as she climbed the ladder and began replacing shingles. She worked carefully, methodically, and tried not to think about the field. She tried not to imagine Caleb standing by the road, waiting. She tried not to wonder how much longer he would wait, and what he would do when he realized she was not going to answer. But by midday, her resolve was crumbling. She found herself working slower, drawing out the job so she would have an excuse not to walk back past his land. When the housewife brought her a cup of water and a piece of bread, Thessa sat on the roof peak and stared out at the valley spread below her, at the patchwork of fields and forests, and the thin silver line of the river cutting through it all. Somewhere out there was Caleb's field and her name growing in it, and the question she could not bring herself to answer. Why had he done it? What did he want from her? And why, when she had spent her whole life being overlooked, did it terrify her so much to finally be seen? The roof took the rest of the day. When she finally climbed down and collected her pay, the sun was low in the sky and the valley was bathed in golden light. She walked back toward the settlement slowly, her feet dragging, and when she reached the point where the road passed Caleb's field, she stopped and made herself look at it head-on. The wheat was nearly 6 inches tall now, thick and healthy. The letters were crisp, perfectly formed. Thessa. Her name, written in a script that would grow and ripen and eventually be harvested, but which for now stood as a declaration that could be read from anywhere in the valley. She wondered how many people had seen it. How many of the villagers had walked past and read her name and understood what it meant. She wondered what they said about it, about her, about the human farmer who had thrown away a quarter of his harvest to court an orc girl who was too cowardly to even acknowledge the gesture. Caleb was not by the road this time. She searched the field and found him near the barn, working on something she could not make out from this distance. He had his back to the road, but she knew he was aware of her. Everything about his posture suggested a man wound tight, waiting. Thessa stood there for a long moment, her heart in her throat. She could walk down to the field. She could climb the fence and cross the bare soil to where he stood and say something, anything, that would acknowledge what he had done. She could smile. She could thank him. She could ask him why. Instead, she turned and walked away, and she hated herself for it even as she did. That night Grell cornered her after dinner. "What is wrong with you?" "Nothing." "You have been acting strange for 2 days. Did something happen?" Thessa looked at her brother, at his earnest young face, and felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to tell him everything. To describe the field and the wheat and the impossible question hanging over her like a storm cloud. But Grell was 17. He did not understand the weight of being seen, the terror of being wanted by someone who could destroy you simply by changing his mind. "I am fine," she said. "Just tired." He did not believe her, but he let it go, and she was grateful. She lay awake again that night, staring at the ceiling, and somewhere in the dark hours before dawn she admitted to herself what she was really afraid of. She was afraid that if she acknowledged the field, if she walked up to Caleb Orson and told him she had seen her name written in wheat, he would tell her it was a mistake, or a joke, or that he had planted it for some other Thessa, some human girl in the village she did not know about. She was afraid he would look at her with those unreadable eyes and say he had not meant it the way she thought, and then she would have to live with the knowledge that she had been foolish enough to hope. It was easier to pretend she had not seen it. Safer. If she did not acknowledge the field, then she could not be hurt by whatever came next. But even as she thought it, she knew it was a lie. She had already been hurt. The moment she saw her name in the soil, the moment she understood what he had done, she had been pierced by something sharp and bright and impossible to ignore. The hurt was already there. The only question was what she would do with it. The third day dawned clear and warm. The kind of spring morning that promised summer was on its way. Thessa dressed slowly, braided her hair with careful precision, and walked to the commons to collect her assignment. She was given ditch work, a tedious job on the far side of the valley that would take her away from Caleb's field entirely. She accepted it without complaint and set off, her tools slung over her shoulder, her mind already half resigned to spending the day in mud and monotony. But as she walked, she found herself slowing. The road north forked just past the village, one branch leading toward the Miller property and the work she had been assigned, the other curving east toward Caleb's land. She stood at the fork for a long time, staring at both paths, her heart pounding in her ears. If she went north, she could avoid the field entirely. She could spend the day working, collect her pay, and go home without having to face the question spelled out in wheat. She could continue pretending for another day, and another, until eventually Caleb gave up and plowed the field under, and they both went back to being strangers who passed on the road without speaking. If she went east, she did not know what would happen. She did not know what she would say, or how he would respond, or whether the weight pressing on her chest would lift or simply grow heavier. Thessa stood there, frozen, until a cart rattled past and the driver gave her a curious look. Then she made a decision that surprised even her. She turned east. She walked slowly, giving herself time to change her mind, time to turn around and run. But her feet kept moving, carrying her down the familiar road, past the line of oaks that marked the boundary of Caleb's land, past the stone wall where wild roses grew. And then she was standing at the edge of his field, looking at her name written in green, and her breath caught in her throat because it was even more beautiful than she remembered. The wheat was nearly a foot tall now, thick and lush. The letters stood out crisp and clear against the dark soil, each line straight and purposeful. He had done this for her. He had spent weeks of back-breaking labor, had sacrificed a significant portion of his harvest, had poured effort and care into creating something that existed only to say her name. To say that she mattered, that she was worth seeing. Thessa's eyes burned. She blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall, and made herself look at the field the way she imagined he must have looked at it when he planned it. The curve of the T, the double S in the middle symmetrical and balanced. The at the end, sharp and decisive. It was not just her name. It was a work of art, grown in soil and sun, and it was hers. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Caleb standing a few yards away, his expression guarded. He looked like he had not slept any more than she had, shadows under his eyes, his jaw tight. He held a shovel in one hand, though he clearly was not using it. He had been working nearby and seen her stop, and now he had come to wait for her answer. For a long moment they simply looked at each other. Thessa opened her mouth to speak and found she had no words. What did one say to a man who had written your name in wheat? Thank you seemed inadequate. I see it felt too small. And the thing she really wanted to say, the question burning in her chest, felt too dangerous to voice, so she said nothing. She looked at him, and then at the field, and then back at him, and she saw the moment hope flickered in his eyes, saw the way his shoulders tensed as though bracing for a blow. And still, she could not make herself speak. Finally, Caleb cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was rough from disuse. You have been walking past for 3 days. It was not an accusation, just a statement of fact. Thessa nodded slowly. I know you can raid, he continued. I have seen you at the market reading the price boards. Another nod. Her throat felt too tight for words. So either you have not looked at the field or you have looked and decided not to say anything. He paused, his gaze steady on her face. Which is it? Thessa forced herself to breathe, forced herself to meet his eyes. I have looked. And I did not know what to say. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. Not relief exactly, but something close to it. You could start with whether you can read what it says. I can read it. Say it then. The command was gentle, but it was a command nonetheless. Thessa swallowed hard and turned back to the field. The letters seemed to shimmer in the morning light, bright and impossible. She took a breath and spoke her own name aloud for the first time in 3 days. Thessa. The word hung in the air between them, solid and real. Caleb let out a slow breath, and when she glanced at him, she saw the ghost of something that might have been a smile touch his mouth. That is right, he said quietly. Why? The question burst out of her before she could stop it, raw and undisguised. Why would you do this? Caleb looked at the field, then back at her. Because I am not good with words, never have been, and I needed you to know. Know what? He was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as though he was trying to force something out that did not want to come. Finally he said, that I see you. That I have been seeing you for a long time, and that I want, he stopped, shook his head. I do not know how to say what I want, so I planted it instead. Thessa stared at him. Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest, a rhythm she did not recognize. "You do not know me." "I know enough. You have never spoken to me, not really. One transaction at the market and that time with the cart, that is all. I have watched you," Caleb said, and there was no apology in his voice. "I have seen how you work, how you treat your brother, how you carry yourself. I know you are careful and kind and stronger than you look. I know you hum when you walk and that you stop to fix things that are broken even when it is not your job. I know," he broke off, looking frustrated. "I know what I need to know." "You do not know what it is like to be Orc," Thessa said quietly. "To be tolerated but not wanted. To know that most people see you as something less than human." "I know what it is like to be seen as a weapon," Caleb replied, his voice low. "To have people look at you and see a killer and nothing else. I know what it is like to come home and have no words left for the things that matter. So yes, I planted a field, because it is the only way I know how to say that I want you here, that I want you in my life, that you matter." Thessa felt the tears spill over then, hot and sudden. She wiped at them angrily, embarrassed, but they kept coming. "I do not know how to do this. I do not know how to be wanted." "Neither do I," Caleb said. He took a step closer, his expression softening. "But I figure we can learn together." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let herself fall into the impossible hope his words offered, to trust that this was real and solid and would not evaporate the moment she reached for it. But fear held her back, a lifetime of being overlooked and dismissed, and she did not know how to let it go. "I need time," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have had 3 days. I need more." Caleb nodded slowly. "All right, how much more?" "I do not know." She looked at the field again, at her name written in wheat, and felt the weight of it pressing down on her. "How long until harvest?" 3 months, give or take." "Will you wait that long?" "I will wait as long as you need." The certainty in his voice undid something in her. Thessa closed her eyes and let herself feel the full weight of what he was offering. Not just the field, not just the declaration, but the patience underneath it. The willingness to let her set the pace, to give her the time she needed to be brave enough to answer. When she opened her eyes again, Caleb was still watching her, his expression unguarded in a way she suspected was rare for him. She saw the vulnerability there, the fear that mirrored her own, and it made her feel less alone. "I have to go," she said abruptly. "I have an assignment." "Ditch work on the north side. You are supposed to be walking north then." "Yes, this is east. I know." She hesitated, then added, "I came to see the field, to really see it, and now you have." "Yes." She took a step back, then another, her eyes still on his face. "Thank you." "For the field, for my name, for," she gestured vaguely, unable to find the words. "Go to your ditch work," Caleb said gently. "I will be here when you are ready." Thessa turned and walked away, and this time she did not pretend she had not seen the field. She looked back once, twice, and saw him still standing there, watching her go, and she felt something shift in her chest that might have been hope. The days that followed were strange and fragile. Thessa walked past the field every morning and every evening, and each time she let herself look at it fully, openly, without pretending. She watched the wheat grow taller, the letters more defined, and she felt the question settle into her bones. What did she want? What was she willing to risk? Caleb did not approach her again. He worked his land, tended his animals, and whenever she walked past he was simply there, visible but not intrusive. Sometimes he was in the barn, sometimes by the fence. Once she saw him sitting on his porch in the evening, a cup of something steaming in his hands, and when she met his eyes across the distance, he raised the cup in a small salute. She found herself smiling in return before she could stop herself, and the look on his face suggested he had seen it. Grell noticed the change in her. "You seem better," he said one evening as they ate dinner together. "Do I? You are not staring at the ceiling anymore, and you are eating." Thessa looked down at her plate, surprised to find it nearly empty. "I suppose I am. Good." Grell hesitated, then asked, "Is it because of the human farmer? The one with the field?" She froze. "What do you know about the field?" "Everyone knows about the field. People have been talking about it for days. The human who planted an orc girl's name in wheat." He grinned. "Some of the boys at the Commons are jealous. They say it is the most romantic thing they have ever heard." Thessa felt her face heat. "It is not, it is just, you like him," Grell said, still grinning. "You like the stoic farmer who cannot talk. I do not know him well enough to like him." "But you want to." She could not argue with that. She did want to know Caleb Orson, wanted to understand what lay beneath that hard exterior, wanted to discover whether the man who planted her name in wheat was as kind and steady as his gesture suggested. And slowly, tentatively, she was beginning to believe she might be brave enough to try. A week after she had finally acknowledged the field, Thessa made a decision. She walked to Caleb's property just after dawn, before the day's work assignments were posted, and she knocked on his door. He answered almost immediately, as though he had been waiting. He was barefoot, his shirt half-buttoned, his hair damp from washing. He looked surprised to see her, but not displeased. "I want to help," Thessa said before she could lose her nerve. "Help with what? The rest of your planting?" "You gave up a quarter of your field for my name. Let me help you plant the rest so you do not lose the whole season." Caleb studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "All right. Give me a minute to finish getting dressed." They worked side by side that day, and the day after, and the day after that. Thessa rearranged her work schedule, trading assignments with other orcs so she could spend her mornings on Caleb's land. They planted wheat in the bare sections, working in companionable silence, and Thessa found herself watching him as much as she watched the work. The way his hands moved over the soil, confident and sure. The way he paused sometimes to wipe sweat from his brow and stare out at the valley as though memorizing it. The way he glanced at her when he thought she was not looking, his expression soft in a way that made her chest ache. He did not talk much, true to his nature, but when he did speak, his words were deliberate and thoughtful. He told her about the land, how he had bought it cheap because no one else thought it was worth farming. He told her about the irrigation system he was building, the crop rotations he had planned, the small improvements he made each season. He did not talk about the war, or whatever had brought him here, and she did not ask. In turn, Thessa found herself talking more than she usually did. She told him about growing up in the orc territories, about the displacement that had brought her family south, about her mother's death, and the weight of caring for Grell. She told him about the small indignities of life in the settlement, the way some humans treated her, the careful balancing act of being visible enough to get work, but not visible enough to attract trouble. "It must be exhausting," Caleb said quietly one afternoon as they rested in the shade of his barn. "It is. You do not have to do that here. On this land, I mean. You can just be yourself." Thessa looked at him, at the sincerity in his face, and felt something in her chest crack open. "I am not sure I remember how." "Then we will figure it out together." They were the same words he had said before, and this time she believed them. The wheat in the field spelling her name grew taller, thicker, more vibrant. It was the healthiest crop on Caleb's land, a testament to the care he had taken with it. Thessa walked through it sometimes in the early mornings, running her hands over the tops of the grain, feeling the rough texture of the stalks against her palms. It still amazed her, the sheer scale of the gesture. No one had ever done anything remotely like this for her. No one had ever cared enough to try. One evening, as they finished planting the last section of the field, Caleb straightened and wiped his hands on his trousers. "That is it." The rest is up to the weather. And luck. And luck, he agreed. He looked at the field, then at her. Thank you for helping. I would not have finished in time without you. I owed you, after what you did. You do not owe me anything, Thessa. The way he said her name, soft and deliberate, made her shiver. She looked up at him, at the fading light catching in his eyes, and felt the distance between them shrink to something manageable. Why me? She asked quietly. You could have any woman in the valley. Why an orc girl you barely know? Caleb was silent for a long moment. Then he said, I could tell you that I think you are beautiful, which is true, or that I admire your strength, which is also true, but the real answer is simpler. When I look at you, I feel less alone, and I have not felt that way in a very long time. Thessa's breath caught. She wanted to reach for him to close the distance between them, but fear still held her back. Not fear of him exactly, but fear of the wanting itself, of letting herself believe this could be real. I feel it too, she admitted. The less alone part. Good. He hesitated, then added, I know this is complicated. I know there are people in the valley who will not understand, who will make things difficult, but I do not care about them. I care about you, and if you are willing to take the risk, so am I. What if it does not work? Then at least we will have tried. It was not a promise of forever. It was not a declaration of undying love, but it was honest, and it was enough. Thessa took a step closer, then another, and when Caleb reached out, she let him take her hand. His palm was rough and warm, and the simple contact sent a jolt through her that felt like coming home. I am still scared, she said softly. So am I. But I want to try. Then we will. They stood there in the fading light, hands clasped, and for the first time in 3 days, in 3 years, in perhaps her entire life, Thessa felt truly seen. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were good. Thessa and Caleb fell into a rhythm, spending mornings working the land and evenings talking on his porch or walking the boundaries of his property. They learned each other slowly, carefully, building a foundation out of small shared moments. Caleb taught her about soil composition and pest management. Thessa taught him a few words of the orc language, laughing at his pronunciation. They cooked meals together, simple fare made more pleasant by the company, and Thessa found herself relaxing in ways she had not thought possible. The valley noticed, of course. People talked. Some of the humans muttered darkly about the impropriety of a human man courting an orc woman. Some of the orcs in the settlement questioned whether Thessa knew what she was doing, whether she was setting herself up to be hurt. But most people, after the initial shock, simply watched and waited to see what would happen. Grell was thrilled. I like him, he announced after meeting Caleb for the first time. He is quiet, but he is solid. You can tell he means what he says. You got all that from one meeting. I am perceptive, Grell grinned. Also, he planted your name in a field. That counts for a lot. As spring turned to summer, the wheat in the field spelling Thessa's name grew golden and heavy. It was nearly time for harvest, and the question that had been hanging over them for months was about to come to a head. Thessa knew Caleb was waiting for her to make the final move, to give him a clear answer about what she wanted, and the closer harvest came, the more aware she was of the decision looming. One evening, as they sat on his porch watching the sun set over the valley, Caleb said quietly, "The wheat is ready. Another week and we should bring it in, I know. I have been thinking about what to do with it." Thessa looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Most farmers would harvest a field like that and sell the grain, but I do not want to sell it. It feels wrong somehow, like erasing something important." "What will you do instead?" He hesitated. "I was thinking I could save the seed, plant it again next year if you wanted. Or give it to you to plant on your own land if you ever get some. I do not want it to disappear." Thessa felt her throat tighten. The gesture was small, almost insignificant, but the care behind it was enormous. He had planted her name, and now he wanted to preserve it to make sure it lived beyond a single season. "I have an idea," she said slowly. "What is it? What if we harvested it together and then next season we planted your name? My answer, written the same way you wrote the question." Caleb went very still. "You mean that?" "Yes. That would take just as much work, just as much land. You would be giving up the same thing you gave up for me," Thessa finished. "A season's worth of harvest, a declaration, a risk." He stared at her, and she saw the moment he understood what she was really offering. Not just help with the harvest, not just a continuation of what they had been building, but a commitment. A promise that she was in this, that she was willing to take the same leap he had taken. "You are sure?" he asked, his voice rough. "I am sure." Caleb reached for her hand, and when she gave it, he brought it to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. It was a courtly gesture, old-fashioned and sweet, and it made Thessa's heart swell in her chest. "Then we will do it," he said. "Together." The harvest took 3 days. Thessa called in favors from the settlement, and a dozen orcs showed up to help, along with a few of the more open-minded humans from the village. They cut the wheat by hand, working in teams, and Thessa made sure to walk every inch of the field, to touch every stalk that had grown in the shape of her name. It felt sacred somehow, this act of gathering what Caleb had planted, and she approached it with the reverence it deserved. On the last day, as the sun dipped low and the final sheaves were bundled, Thessa stood in the center of where the letter T had been and called for quiet. The workers gathered around, curious, and Caleb came to stand beside her, his expression questioning. Thessa took a breath and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I want to thank you all for helping with this harvest. This field," she gestured to the bare earth around them, "was a gift, the most generous gift I have ever received, and I want you all to witness my answer." She turned to Caleb, her heart pounding, and said, "Next season we will plant your name, Caleb, right here in this same field, so everyone will know that what you started I am continuing, that what you offered I accept." A cheer went up from the crowd, loud and genuine. Caleb's eyes widened, and for a moment he looked as though he might actually smile, a real smile that reached his eyes. Instead, he pulled Thessa close and wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight while the workers whistled and clapped. "Thank you," he murmured into her hair. "For what?" "For seeing me too." Thessa pulled back just enough to look at him. "I have been seeing you since the first day. I was just too scared to admit it. And now I am still scared, but I am more scared of losing this." He kissed her then, a simple press of lips that tasted of salt and wheat dust, and the beginning of something neither of them had dared hope for. The crowd cheered louder, and Thessa laughed against his mouth, giddy and breathless and more alive than she had felt in years. The summer passed in a haze of work and warmth. Caleb's remaining fields yielded a decent harvest, not as much as he might have gotten if he had planted the entire acreage, but enough to see him through the winter with some to spare. Thessa spent more and more time on his land, until it began to feel like her land too, and when Caleb suggested she and Grell move into his house, she found herself saying yes before she had fully thought it through. The move happened in early autumn. Grell was delighted, claiming one of the spare rooms and immediately setting about making it his own. Thessa took the room across from Caleb's, though they both knew it was only a matter of time before the arrangement shifted. For now, propriety was observed, and Thessa was grateful for the slow pace. She needed time to adjust to the idea of permanence, to the knowledge that she was building a life here. The valley adjusted too. The initial gossip faded, replaced by a cautious acceptance. Thessa and Caleb became a fixture at the village market, shopping together, and while a few people still gave them sidelong looks, most simply nodded in greeting and went about their business. It was not perfect, but it was livable, and that was enough. In late autumn, as the days grew short and the first frost kissed the fields, Caleb and Thessa began planning the next season's planting. They sketched out the letters of his name on paper, debating proportions and spacing, and Thessa felt a thrill of anticipation every time she looked at the design. This would be her work, her declaration, and she wanted it to be perfect. Winter came, slow and cold. Thessa and Caleb spent long evenings by the fire, talking or reading or simply sitting together in companionable silence. Grell adapted to life on the farm with ease, proving himself capable and willing to learn. He and Caleb developed an easy rapport, and Thessa often caught herself watching the two of them work together and feeling a fierce gratitude that her brother had found a home here too. One night, deep in winter, Caleb took Thessa's hand across the table and said, "I want to marry you." It was not a question exactly, but it was close enough. Thessa looked at him, at the firelight catching in his eyes, and felt the last of her fear dissolve. "Yes," she said simply. "You do not want time to think about it." "I have been thinking about it for months. The answer is yes." They married in early spring, just before planting season. It was a small ceremony, held in the village commons with a handful of friends and neighbors in attendance. The local magistrate officiated, his expression carefully neutral, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Thessa felt a surge of joy so intense it left her breathless. Caleb kissed her, deep and sure, and the assembled crowd clapped politely. Grell whooped, which earned him a few disapproving looks, but Thessa did not care. She was married. She was wanted. She was home. The planting of Caleb's name began the next day. Thessa measured and marked the field with stakes and string, and then she and Caleb and Grell worked together to sow the seed. It was hard work, back-breaking and slow, but Thessa approached it with the same care Caleb had shown when planting her name. Each letter had to be perfect. Each line had to be straight. This was her answer, written in the earth, and she wanted it to be worthy of what he had given her. By the time they finished, 2 weeks later, Thessa's hands were blistered and her back ached, but she felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond the physical. She stood at the edge of the field and looked at the rows of freshly turned soil, at the faint lines that would soon sprout into green letters spelling Caleb, and she felt the circle close. He had declared his love in wheat. She had answered in kind. And now they had a future stretching before them, rooted in soil and sunlight and the quiet, steady work of building a life together. The wheat grew tall and healthy, just as hers had. By midsummer the letters were clear and bright, visible from the road, and travelers passing through the valley often stopped to stare. Some smiled. Some shook their heads, but most simply noted it and moved on, one more strange story in a world full of them. Harvest came again, and this time the entire valley turned out to help. Humans and orcs worked side by side, cutting the wheat that spelled Caleb's name, and when the last sheaf was bundled, Thessa stood in the center of the field and felt a peace she had not known was possible. That evening, as they sat on the porch and watched the stars come out, Caleb said, "I have been thinking." "About what?" "About next season, what we should plant." Thessa smiled. "Not our names again, I hope. The novelty might wear off." "No, I was thinking we could plant something practical. Wheat we can actually sell." "That sounds sensible. But maybe," he added slowly, "in a year or two, if we are still feeling sentimental, we could plant something else. A phrase, maybe, or a question." "What kind of question?" He looked at her, his expression soft. "I do not know yet. But I figure we have time to decide." Thessa reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. "We do. All the time in the world." They sat in silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, and Thessa thought about the field lying fallow behind them, resting for the next season. It would be planted again and again, each year a new declaration or a new promise. But for now it was enough to sit here, hand in hand with the man who had written her name in wheat, and know that she had written his name back. A year passed, and then another. Life on the farm settled into a comfortable rhythm. Caleb and Thessa worked the land together, experimenting with crop rotations and irrigation methods, and slowly the farm began to thrive. They added a small orchard, apple and pear trees that would not bear fruit for years, but which promised future abundance. They expanded the barn and bought more livestock. They hosted neighbors for dinners and helped with the harvest on surrounding farms. And gradually, the strangeness of their marriage faded into simple acceptance. Grell grew into a capable young man, strong and good-natured. And when he turned 20, he announced his intention to claim a piece of land on the far edge of Caleb's property and start his own farm. Caleb helped him build a small house, and Thessa spent weeks preparing the soil for Grell's first planting. It was hard to watch her brother become independent, but it was also deeply satisfying to see him flourish. In their third year of marriage, Thessa realized she was pregnant. The news filled her with a terror she had not expected, a sudden awareness of all the ways the world could be cruel to a child born of mixed heritage. But Caleb held her through the fear, his arms steady and sure, and by the time their daughter was born, Thessa had made peace with the uncertainty. They named her Delara, a name that meant hope in the old Orc tongue, but which sounded human enough to spare her some trouble. She had her father's eyes and her mother's green skin, and she was the most beautiful thing Thessa had ever seen. Caleb doted on her, spending hours rocking her to sleep or walking the fields with her strapped to his chest, and Thessa fell in love with him all over again watching him become a father. Delara was 2 when their second daughter was born, a tiny fierce thing they named Kessa. And 3 years after that came a son, Rhett, who had his father's quiet determination and his mother's stubbornness. The house filled with noise and laughter, and Thessa often found herself marveling at how far she had come from the scared girl who had pretended not to see her name written in wheat. The farm prospered. Caleb's reputation as a skilled and fair-minded landowner grew, and orcs and humans alike came to him for advice or help. Thessa became known for her work with soil health, her experiments with composting and cover crops yielding impressive results. Together they built something that felt solid and lasting, a legacy they could pass to their children. One evening, when Delara was 7 and already reading at a level far beyond her years, she asked, "Papa, is it true you planted Mama's name in a field?" Caleb glanced at Thessa, a smile tugging at his mouth. "It is." "Why?" "Because I wanted her to know I loved her and I did not have the words to say it." Delara frowned. "That seems like a lot of work." "It was." "Why not just tell her?" Thessa laughed. "Some things are easier to show than to say, little one." "Did it work?" "Yes," Thessa said softly, meeting Caleb's eyes across the table. "It worked." Delara seemed satisfied with this answer, and the conversation moved on to other things. But later, after the children were in bed, Thessa found Caleb standing at the window, looking out at the dark fields. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. "The first time I saw you," he said quietly. "You were walking down the road, humming to yourself, and I thought you were the most self-contained person I had ever seen. Like you did not need anyone or anything, and I wanted to be someone you needed. You are. I know that now, but back then I was not sure you would ever see me." Thessa leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I saw you. I was just too scared to admit it. And now I am grateful every day that you were brave enough for both of us." They stood there in the quiet, wrapped in each other, and outside the fields lay dark and full of promise. In a few months, they would plant again, the same practical crops they had been growing for years, and the field that had once spelled their names would be just another part of the farm. But the memory of it remained, written in the soil and in their hearts, a reminder of the day a man who could not speak planted a declaration in wheat, and the woman who loved him answered in kind. Years passed, and the children grew. Delara became a scholar, fascinated by history and language, and left the farm to study in the southern cities. Kessa stayed, her love of the land as deep as her parents', and she learned everything Caleb and Thessa could teach her about farming. Rhett split his time between the farm and his Uncle Grell's property, showing an aptitude for animal husbandry that delighted everyone. The valley changed too. The settlement of orcs grew larger, more established, and intermarriage between humans and orcs became less rare. Caleb and Thessa were not pioneers exactly, but they were part of the first wave, and they took quiet pride in the role they had played in making the valley a more accepting place. On their 20th anniversary, Caleb surprised Thessa by planting her name again. She discovered it one morning when she went out to check the irrigation, and she stood at the edge of the field and cried, overwhelmed by the fact that he still thought she was worth the effort. He came to stand beside her, his hair more gray than brown now, his hands still strong despite the years. "I thought you should be reminded," he said quietly. "Of what?" "That I still see you, that I will always see you." Thessa turned to him, tears streaming down her face, and kissed him with the same intensity she had felt 20 years ago when she finally admitted she loved him. "I do not need a field to know that. But thank you. You are welcome." They harvested the wheat together that fall, just the two of them, working slowly and savoring every moment. And when the last sheaf was cut, Thessa stood in the bare earth and looked at the man who had written her name in soil and seed, and she felt the fullness of a life well lived. Caleb took her hand. "No regrets." "None," she said firmly. "Not a single one." He smiled, a rare, full smile that made him look years younger. "Good. Neither do I." They walked back to the house hand in hand, the evening light casting long shadows across the fields, and behind them the earth lay ready for the next season's planting. There would be more years, more harvests, more moments of joy and struggle and quiet contentment. But for now, it was enough to be here together. Two people who had found each other against the odds and built a love that grew like wheat rooted deep, reaching high and golden in the light.